imagine I was a bit discouraged to hear things like this.
Well, I've been on a long journey of nearly 20 years now, consciously doing this, and some force has been pushing me in different directions through intuition, through urges. I just got to do this. I've just got to go there. As I've gone through this and followed it, and who the force is and they are, I don't know. I'm not really that interested, funnily enough, because I just go with it and I'll remember what it's all about when I leave this genetic spacesuit.
Now, here is the mystery, considering all that we have learned so far.
I think there's a lot of this whole New Age area, you know, of ascended masters and all the Blavatsky stuff and Ashtar Command. I say that that is a belief system controlled by the same force, which is also trawling that bloody energy as we go along.
Again, considering everything we have just learned, this is clearly an admission that he has been lied to by the spirits all of his life. I mean, if they told him that they were Alice Bailey's ascended masters, which they did, and they taught him theosophy word for word, which they did, he must be admitting here that all that he was taught is a lie. But the problem is that he has never stopped teaching and promoting the beings he talked to or what they told him to teach. He clearly attributes everything he is to them.
Among these messages that was given to me in 1990 were, he will say things and wonder where they came from. They will be our words. Sometimes we will put knowledge into his mind. Sometimes he will be led to knowledge. And another one was, a little bit later, arduous seeking is not necessary.
I've given this a lot of thought, and I've come to some possible conclusions. Here are the facts. Icke never has mentioned the name Alice Bailey in his early books, although in them it's clear that he's teaching her doctrine, things like about the seven rays and the coming evolution, the solar logos, the new age, Atlantis, Lemuria, the age of Aquarius, being destroyed because of bad evolution, the earth spirit, the moon problem, her particular brand of reincarnation, even wearing certain colors. He never once, though, attributes any of it to her. He attributes it all to the spirits that he channeled. He says he got all this information from the spirit world, which I'm willing to believe, and therefore I suppose it's possible that he hasn't made the connection that everything he believes is from Alice Bailey himself yet. He may have never noticed that what the spirits told him was word for word Alice Bailey and or theosophy. The other possibility is that because he has alluded to in the past the idea that sometimes during channelings the paradigm of the channeler gets in the way of the message, and so therefore the message can be tainted by the messenger. He refers to this, I think, to try to explain the fact that he has pages and pages of material of his conversations with Jesus, whom he nowadays says never existed. The idea is that, well, the channeler believed in Jesus, so the name was messed up. But, as we will see later, these beings do much, much more than claim to be some entity. They play the role to the very end and really expect you to go tell people what they told you. There are many problems with this, but the biggest one is that, let's say some of the psychics that he talked to were big Alice Bailey fans, and so he got information that was filtered through their paradigm. Now that's still not an excuse, because we're right back to the problem of, well, if he learned later on that Alice Bailey and her ascended masters lead to a new world order ideology, why is he still teaching us the exact same ideology, only packaged in a way that seems to try to hide the obvious source? We will come back to the investigation of Icke's extra-dimensional entities to see if we can determine anything more about them later on. But for now, let's move on to some of Icke's more earthly sources of his information to see if we can determine anything about the evolution from his early material to his current material, like reptilians. The single most influential person in the development of Icke's current ideas is a man named Brian Desborough. Desborough wrote a lot of conspiracy articles and posted them on the internet in the mid-90s into the 2000s. Later, these articles would be compiled into a book. Desborough is behind an astonishing amount of Icke's research. There's a lot of interesting things about Mr. Desborough. First of all, despite the fact that his bio says that he served as a director of research and development for several American high-technology companies and has provided consultation to a company involved in deep space research, there's no record of him doing anything like this on the internet, which seems odd since you would think that if a person who was publishing material on the internet so early in its history, that he would also leave some trail to his apparently earth-changing scientific research. Another interesting thing is that despite the fact that Icke, when referring to Desborough, calls him his American scientist friend, you can read Desborough's own bio to find out that his information was given to him by spiritual beings, like Icke. Desborough says, during an out-of-body experience which occurred in 1971, he encountered 5 highly spiritually evolved, non-physical beings who informed him that he must write a revisionist history of the world. The purpose of the book was to take the readers out of their comfort zones by presenting them with truth regarding such diverse subjects like the true location of Atlantis, the duplicitous acts of the Illuminati, and the fundamentals of free energy technology. It was not until later that the author learned that the non-physical entities that he had encountered were associated with a non-physical directorate who were the overlords of a group of terrestrial mystics known through the centuries as the Quadragon. It is the role of the Quadragon to intercede in the political affairs of the world periodically in an attempt to elevate the level of human spirituality. It's interesting that, like David, Desborough also speaks out very harshly against Alice Bailey and the Ascended Masters in his book. He even says, the Lucius Trust is a major New Age command center on behalf of the Illuminati, and her book, Education in the New Age, outlined a social engineering program which later was adopted by the Club of Rome. In it, she wrote, the science of eugenics will grow. Desborough also writes, Ascended Masters were, in actuality, merely nicknames she had assigned to the wealthy Masonic patrons of the Theosophical Society, and displayed outrage against phony psychics claiming to channel these non-existent beings. But, in an equally amazing feat of doublethink, Desborough believes the exact thing that Alice Bailey believes. That is, that the non-physical directorate, or ascended spiritual beings, are intervening in the political affairs of the world in an attempt to elevate the level of human spirituality, which is arguably the main point to theosophy, as well as all the stuff about the Aryans, which we will see later. As far as Desborough's scientific background, according to his bio, it seems to be limited to a story he tells where a chance encounter with a pediatrician who had been one of Wilhelm Reich's research associates gave him access to all of his notes, which he says enabled him to acquire a knowledge of weather engineering and orgonautic science. In addition, as luck would have it, a similar thing happened to him, but this time it was with Nikola Tesla's notes. He says he met an old lady at a spiritual healing circle who had asked him if he liked Nikola Tesla. She apparently then told him a story that he writes on his website. It says, quote, one day, continued the lady, Tesla felt a tug on his coat sleeve. Looking down, he saw the landlord's 12-year-old son, who said, Mr. Tesla, will you teach me all that you know? Tesla was so impressed that the boy became one of Tesla's enthusiastic protégés, and later married the lady the author had just met. The lady then provided the author with some of her late husband's research notes on free energy and anti-gravitic technology. In this manner, many doors were opened, thus enabling the author to acquire meaningful data for his 2 books. The strangest part about Desborough's bio, in my opinion, is that he claims to be an expert at deprogramming mind control victims. He claims that he does this in order to get information out of them to help his research into the New World Order. He has written quite a lot about trauma-based mind control, and at that time, very little was known on the internet about it. And it does appear he knows quite a lot about how to program multiples. This will become very interesting as we continue this investigation. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at how David Icke was influenced by Brian Desborough. Icke's book, The Biggest Secret, is the first time that I know of that Icke mentions Desborough in print. He dedicated that particular book to him, and he cites him profusely throughout the book as his source for things like Martians coming to Earth and founding the Aryan race, which the reptilians used to overtake the planet. Brian is also the source for much of the information on the Babylonian world, and things like black people are a result of the Earth being closer to the sun at one point, the Ice Age being an illusion, monoatomic gold, directed energy weapons, UFOs are government craft, crop circles are space beams, David's new view on Jesus, and much more. Ivan Fraser, the other person who David dedicated his book, The Biggest Secret, to, later spoke out against David and said this about Brian Desborough, quote, "Is there anything David could tell us about Brian Desborough's background to allay any doubts we may have about his integrity, considering his massive influence in the content and direction of The Biggest Secret?" Also, Icke's subsequent book called Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center Disaster is no better than a copy and pasting of Brian Desborough's article entitled The 9/11 Disaster, The Myth and Reality. If you have read Icke's Alice in Wonderland book on 9/11, please read Desborough's article when you have time, and you will see that the information in there is exactly the same, the wording, even the mistakes. But the curious thing is that even though it's clear from reading Desborough's 9/11 article that Desborough is the one who did all the research, Icke doesn't cite Desborough one time in his book, even though it's painfully obvious that it was taken from him. I think that Desborough was quite content to feed information to Icke, even if he got no credit. One example of this is in regard to the reptilian scandal. As I mentioned, The Biggest Secret is dedicated to Brian Desborough and another man named Ivan Fraser. According to Fraser, it was Desborough that introduced Icke to Arizona Wilder, and it was her testimony that ended up being the reason why Icke went public with the reptilians thing. Desborough also admits to introducing Icke to Arizona Wilder, as well as arranging the meeting between the two, because Wilder was a victim of trauma-based mind control, and apparently Desborough had accessed her programming in order to get information about the Illuminati. According to him, he was amazed to find that she confirmed what he had already been telling Icke, which will be important later. This is Ivan Fraser's side of the story. He had been proofreading The Biggest Secret for David Icke, and he found out about the reptilians thing this way. He says, quote, "Arizona Wilder was not mentioned at all in the draft copy of The Biggest Secret, which I had read. David had not met her yet. When the book was released, people started ringing me with questions like, is it true about the reptiles? And is this stuff about the royal family true? At which time I replied that I thought it was, based on the fact that the version that I had read stated only the theory of reptilians and that certain of the royals were involved in satanic rituals. Soon I heard about Arizona Wilder. David stated that he saw his encounter with Arizona Wilder as an amazing synchronicity which endorsed his work in his latest book. How could she have known all this stuff which tallied so exactly with The Biggest Secret? Well, I believe I'm not as naive as David, and I know exactly how she could have known. Icke was passing copies of the book via post to me and others for editing. Fraser continues, this brings in another character who is pivotal to the entire Biggest Secret thesis. It was a contact of David's named Brian Desborough, who introduced Arizona to David. Brian is mentioned as a source for a great deal of the information in the book, having supplied most of the material on which David based his idea about the Martians coming to Earth and founding the Aryan race, which the reptilians use as a vehicle to overtake the planet. Brian is also the source for much of the information David had compiled on the Babylonian world, its myths, and how they fed into the sinister secret societies. It was Brian Desborough who was also looking at the draft copy of The Biggest Secret at the same time as myself, i.e. before David met Arizona Wilder. Therefore, the fact that Brian Desborough may be responsible for fundamentally leading the direction of David's research, if not planting much of the basis of the book in David's mind, is obvious. But then, to be the same person responsible for giving him the so-called eyewitness to testify to the verity of that information is highly suspicious. Brian also writes articles on mind control and seems very knowledgeable on the subject. Is it possible that he could be directly involved in some way that we are not being told about? Fraser also says that Arizona endorsed Desborough's theories so closely that, quote, you would almost think she had already read the book or had been given the information beforehand. He continues, or considering that she claims to be an ex-mind-controlled slave, could it be that she was pre-programmed? Testimony from Mark Phillips and Kathy O'Brien as to how arduous it is to deprogram a CIA slave makes me very suspicious that Arizona Wilder could be considered reliable. She claims that since her programmer died, the programming broke down. I don't believe this can be accepted as such, and external experts would have to be brought in to convince me that if she was controlled to the highest level, that she could be so deprogrammed now to be considered reliable. Brian Desborough describes the story in this way. My own research, based on unpublished astrophysical data, revealed that Mars originally occupied our planet's orbit and was populated by a technologically advanced Aryan race. A celestial catastrophe displaced Mars into its present orbit, forcing the Aryan survivors to colonize our planet and subsequently construct the Great Pyramid. Then they were overthrown by an evil priesthood who established the royal court of the dragon in Egypt. While David was writing his book, it was